He thought divorcing her was the smartest move of his life. He was wrong. Within 24 hours of signing those papers, Grayson Vale's billion-dollar empire began to bleed. Warehouses raided, offshore accounts frozen, allies vanishing like smoke. He blamed rivals. He blamed enemies. He never once considered that the quiet woman he'd just thrown away had spent years building the perfect weapon out of his own secrets. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Elena Ashcroft wasn't just his wife. She was the youngest sister of three of the most dangerous men alive. And she had been waiting for exactly this moment. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one will change the way you think about silence. The divorce papers were signed at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. Grayson Vale remembered the exact time because he'd checked his watch twice. Not out of sentimentality, not out of any creeping hesitation, but because he had a lunch meeting at noon with the Port Authority commissioners, and he didn't want the paperwork to run long. It didn't. Elena had already signed her copies the evening before, leaving them on the kitchen counter with a pen set neatly on top, the way you'd leave a grocery list. He'd almost laughed when his attorney, Morris Duff, slid the documents across the conference table and pointed to the flagged lines. Grayson signed without reading them. There was nothing to read. Elena had asked for nothing. No division of assets, no spousal support, no claim on the Meridian Holdings portfolio or the properties in Zurich and Cape Town. She'd taken her personal belongings and a single checking account with a balance Grayson could replace in an afternoon. Morris had cleared his throat once and said carefully, "She didn't retain counsel, Grayson." "I know. That's unusual." "Elena is unusual." Morris didn't push it. That was what Grayson paid him for, not to push it. By the time Grayson rode the elevator back down to the lobby of his own building, VCY Tower, 47 stories of steel and polarized glass anchored in the financial district's heart, he was already thinking about the Meridian acquisition call scheduled for Thursday. Elena had already faded to background noise. He told himself it wasn't coldness. He told himself it was efficiency. He'd built an empire by cutting losses before they calcified. He almost believed it. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket as the elevator reached the lobby. He assumed it was his assistant Petra, confirming the lunch location. He didn't look at it until he was in the back seat of his car, and by then the message wasn't from Petra. It was from a number he didn't recognize. 12 digits, no country code he could place immediately. The ledger was never burned. Think carefully about what that means. Grayson stared at the message for 3 full seconds. Then he closed it, slid the phone back into his pocket, and told his driver to take him to the Harbor Restaurant on Callaway Pier. He'd made his career reading threats, and this one felt amateur, someone testing his nerves. It happened periodically. He didn't dignify it. He should have. The lunch with the port commissioners ran 40 minutes over schedule, because Commissioner Harlan Briggs, a round, perpetually flushed man who sweated through his collar, even in winter, wouldn't stop asking questions about the Black Tide Terminal lease renewal. Grayson answered everything with the measured confidence he'd spent 20 years perfecting. He ate half his sea bass, he drank sparkling water, he smiled at the right moments. He gave nothing away. It wasn't until he was back in his car, heading to VCI Tower, that his phone started hemorrhaging. The first call was from his head of operations, Derek Sow. Derek never called during business hours unless something had gone sideways. "What is it?" Grayson said, not a question. "We've got a problem at Warehouse 7. A pause, and Grayson could hear other voices in the background, the particular low-register urgency of men trying not to raise their voices. "Federal agents, customs enforcement, and somebody else. I can't confirm who yet. They're not talking to us. They've got a warrant." Grayson's jaw tightened. "How many units?" "At least 30, maybe more. They came in 2 waves. Get Morris on the phone, right now. Don't let anyone on site say a word. Not a name, not a word." He ended the call and immediately dialed Morris, who picked up on the second ring, already sounding clipped and controlled in the way that meant he'd already heard something. "I know about 7, Morris said. "I'm pulling the filing right now. Grayson, the warrant was issued this morning, before 9. Grayson went very still. Before 9. Before the divorce papers were even signed. "Someone moved fast," Morris said. Very fast. The probable cause affidavit, whoever submitted it had detailed knowledge of the inventory logs from the last 18 months. Grayson pressed his thumb into the bridge of his nose. That information doesn't exist outside of 3 people. It exists somewhere, Morris said, because it's in the affidavit. He told Morris to send everything to his private server, ended the call, and stared out the window at the harbor, at the gray water and the cranes moving along the dock line like patient giants. His chest felt strange, not fear. He'd trained himself out of fear as a teenager, when fear had been a liability he couldn't afford. But something below fear, something in the body that fear eventually becomes when it outlives the emotion. His phone buzzed again. Derek, this time with a voice note. Grayson, Warehouse 14 is getting the same treatment, and I just got a call from Sao Paulo. The Mendez corridor is locked, all 3 transit points, frozen by local customs authority acting on international request. Grayson, whatever this is, it's coordinated. Coordinated. The word landed like a stone in still water. Grayson had enemies. Every man who'd built what he'd built had enemies. But coordination at this scale, this speed, this simultaneity, that wasn't rivalry. That was architecture. Someone had drawn a blueprint and spent time building this. Months, possibly longer. His eyes went back to the text message he'd dismissed 2 hours ago. The ledger was never burned. He made himself breathe slowly. The ledger. 7 years ago, when his operation was still adolescent, profitable but exposed, running through channels that didn't yet have the legal shell structure he'd since built around them, there had been a leather journal, a physical record his first accountant, a paranoid recluse named Thomas Fell, had kept by hand. Every transaction, every name, every shell entity. Thomas had died in a boating accident in 2019. Grayson had recovered the journal from Thomas's personal storage and burned it himself in the fireplace of his Aspen property. He had watched it burn. He had stayed until there was nothing left but ash. He'd been certain. He pulled up the unknown number on his phone and tried to call it back. Deadline. Of course. His driver pulled up to VCI Tower. Grayson didn't move for a moment. Then he got out. The next 6 hours were controlled chaos of the highest order, the kind Grayson had navigated before, though never at this velocity or breadth. Morris worked the phones from a war room on the 31st floor. Derek managed the operational sites, coordinating lawyers on the ground at Warehouse 7 and 14, while fielding calls from panicked regional managers in 3 time zones. 2 of Grayson's banking contacts went silent simultaneously, a thing that had never happened before in any context. The offshore account, linked to the Cayman holding entity, a structure so deeply buried that Grayson privately doubted even his own CFO understood its full architecture, was frozen by mid-afternoon. His CFO, a brilliant, meticulous man named Aldous Park, appeared in Grayson's office at 4:15 with a color drained from his face that Grayson hadn't seen in 15 years of working together. Aldous. Grayson gestured to the chair across the desk. Aldous didn't sit. The Cayman freeze is a secondary action. The primary account, the one underneath it, the one you and I never talked about in writing, that one's gone. Grayson looked at him. Gone. As of 11:40 this morning, transfer initiated, destination unknown, flagged simultaneously by 3 international financial compliance bodies. The compliance flags are what triggered the freeze upstream. Grayson. Aldous put both hands on the edge of the desk, and his voice dropped to almost nothing. Whoever did this knew the account existed, not the Cayman entity, the one underneath it. The silence in the room was complete. That account had no documentation. It existed in no filing, no record, no discovery. The only people who had ever known about it were Grayson himself and Tomas Fell, who had set it up before he died, and whoever had just emptied it. Grayson sent Aldous home. He sat alone in his office with the lights of the city assembling themselves below the windows, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the specific sensation of not knowing what he didn't know. That was the thing about a well-built trap. You didn't feel it until it had already closed. He thought about Elena. Not romantically, not guiltily. He wasn't built for either in any productive way. He thought about her practically, the way he would assess a counterpart in a negotiation. Elena Ashcroft, 29 months his junior, from a family that had never come up clearly in any background check he'd commissioned before their marriage. She'd come from money, that much was evident in her bearing, her ease with certain rooms, but she'd deflected every inquiry with gentle misdirection so elegant he'd eventually stopped asking. He'd told himself it was a quirk of her character, a privacy instinct. He'd appreciated it, actually. It meant she didn't ask about his. He hadn't once considered that her privacy might be infrastructure. He hadn't once asked himself why a woman of her caliber had accepted his proposal, moved into his world, and spent 4 years being quietly, perfectly present without ever once needing anything from him. He pulled out his personal phone, the clean one, not the operational line, and scrolled to her number. He stared at it for a long time. He called. It rang 4 times. Then her voice, unhurried, the same way she'd always spoken to him, like she had all the time in the world and wasn't especially concerned about his. "Grayson, I need to see you." A pause. Not a surprised pause. A considered one. "When?" "Tonight." "I'm available at 8, she said. "You know the address." She hung up. She was renting a townhouse on the west side of the city, on a quiet, tree-lined block that had nothing in common with the kind of address Grayson had always assumed she'd eventually want. He'd expected something reflective of resentment, something designed to announce herself, to signal that she was fine and he should know it. Instead, the building was understated. Dark brick, window boxes, good locks, the kind of place you chose when you wanted to think clearly. She opened the door before he knocked. She was wearing dark trousers and a gray cashmere sweater. No jewelry except a simple watch. Her hair was down. She looked, Grayson thought with a kind of involuntary discomfort, better than she had in years. Clearer, like something had been lifted. "Come in," she said. The interior was spare, almost no furniture beyond essentials. Boxes, partially unpacked. A kitchen table with 2 chairs. She'd put a glass of water on one side and nothing on the other, and without speaking, she sat down at the side with the water, which meant he had to sit opposite her and have nothing in front of him. A small thing. He noticed it immediately. She had always been precise with small things. "My operation is under federal investigation," he said. No preamble. He didn't know another way to start. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "What do you know exactly?" She reached under the table and set something on the surface between them. It was a leather journal, old and worn, with a cracked spine and a water stain along the upper right corner. The stain was shaped like a crescent. Grayson had looked at that stain for hours in the Aspen house before he burned it. He had burned it. He had watched it burn. His voice came out with less steadiness than he intended. "That's not possible." "Tomas made 2 copies, Elena said simply. "He gave the second to someone he trusted before his accident. A precaution. He was a careful man." "He gave it to you." She didn't answer directly, which was its own answer. "There are 114 transactions documented in that journal, Grayson. 47 of them are still prosecutable under current international statute. The remaining 67 reference entities and individuals whose cooperation with law enforcement in exchange for reduced exposure has been documented separately and submitted through appropriate channels." The room seemed to narrow slightly around him. He had a physical sensation, not unlike the moment in a vehicle before impact, when you see what's happening but the timeline compresses and your body can't respond at the speed your mind can perceive. "You built a case." "I built a case." "You've been building it since year 2 of our marriage," she said without inflection. "When I understood what you were." He stared at her. He was looking for anger in her face, because anger he could work with, could negotiate against, could disarm. There was none. She was simply telling him a fact, the way a doctor tells you what is wrong and what is necessary with a kind of clarity that exists past personal feeling. "Why didn't you go to the authorities first?" "Because law enforcement, on its own, rarely has the institutional depth to dismantle something like what you built," she said. "They needed testimony, cooperation agreements, financial documentation, and a coordinated action plan that aligned jurisdictional authority across multiple territories. That kind of infrastructure takes time to build. I built it." She picked up her water glass and set it down again without drinking. I also needed you to be unable to countermaneuver. If you'd had any warning, you would have liquidated and vanished. You're very good at that. Elena, the divorce was the signal, she said. When I walked out, everything began. The timing was exact. He leaned back in his chair. He became aware, in a way he hadn't been in years, of his own heartbeat. It was fast, faster than he'd let it get in a long time. You could have destroyed me without doing any of this. You could have taken everything in the divorce. I didn't want your money, she said, and something in her tone shifted, just fractionally, towards something rawer before she locked it back down. I wanted your empire dismantled. Those are not the same thing. He looked at the journal on the table between them. He looked at her. He opened his mouth to say something. He didn't know what, some instinct toward negotiation or apology or threat, the three registers he'd inhabited his whole adult life. And then his phone rang. Not his personal line, his operational phone, the one he'd transferred to his inside jacket pocket, the one that almost never rang anymore because the people who called it preferred encrypted messaging. He looked at the screen. No number, no identifier, just a single character, a black asterisk. He'd never received a call from that designation before. He'd heard of it. Every man at his level had heard of it the way sailors heard about a particular stretch of ocean, with the understanding that if you were ever in those waters, something had already gone very wrong. He answered. The voice on the other end was male, older, with an accent he couldn't place, Eastern European dissolved through decades of travel until it had become essentially nationless. It spoke for 31 seconds. It did not ask questions. It did not invite response. It conveyed a verdict. When the call ended, Grayson set the phone face down on the table. Elena was watching him. She hadn't moved. That was the commission, he said. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes acknowledged it. She knew what the commission was. Of course she did. They've withdrawn all territorial recognition, he said. His voice was flat now, the flatness of a man calculating in real time how much he has left. Every alliance, every arrangement, every protected corridor. Dissolved. My organization is to be considered independent and unaffiliated as of, he glanced at his watch, 40 minutes ago. Without protection, without institutional recognition in the world he'd operated in, Grayson Vale was not a billionaire with a criminal enterprise. He was simply a criminal, exposed on every side with no allies left who had any reason to help him and every reason to accelerate his collapse. He thought of Vivian. He'd been trying not to. Vivian Cross, his soon-to-be something, they hadn't married yet, a fact that now felt less like timing and more like providence, who had been, until this morning, living in the penthouse at VCI Tower, handling his calendar, managing his most sensitive correspondence, positioned at the absolute center of everything he ran. He pulled out his personal phone and called her. Straight to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called the front desk at VCI Tower. The night attendant picked up on the second ring. This is Vale. Is Miss Cross in the building? A pause. The kind of pause that wasn't about looking something up, but about how to say something. Mr. Vale, Miss Cross vacated her suite this morning, around 11. She left with several bags and 2 men I didn't recognize. She told me she was traveling. She didn't leave a number. Grayson pressed the phone against his ear until the plastic edge hurt. 11 o'clock. Before the warehouses were raided. Before the commission called. Before any of it was visible. She'd left before the trap had visibly sprung, which meant she had known it was springing, which meant she was not what she had appeared to be. His eye dropped to the kitchen table, to the blank space where Elena was still sitting, watching him with that terrible, undisturbed composure. He looked at her and felt something he hadn't experienced since he was 17 years old, and understood for the first time that the world didn't operate the way he'd been told it did. He felt genuinely, comprehensively outmaneuvered. She's gone, he said. Elena's eyes changed then, very slightly. Not satisfaction, that wasn't it. Something more like a soldier's recognition when a second front has just opened. Who? Vivian. He paused. She left this morning, before everything started. Elena was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, How long has she had access to your encrypted files? Since he stopped. Since she became his executive assistant 4 years ago. Since she had moved gradually from scheduling his meetings to managing his correspondence to sitting across from him in rooms where things were discussed that should never have been discussed in front of anyone. He trusted her the way powerful men trust people who make themselves indispensable, completely, and without ever thinking about it. 4 years, so Elena stood up from the table. Then we have a problem, she said, that is significantly larger than you. She walked to the kitchen counter, picked up her own phone, and made a call. She spoke 2 sentences in a language Grayson didn't speak, didn't recognize, couldn't place. It took him a moment to understand that it wasn't a language he'd simply failed to learn. It was a private language, a family code. When she hung up, she turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd walked through her door, he saw something in her face that was not calm. It was not panic, either. It was the controlled, high-intensity alertness of someone who has just recalculated a situation and found new variables she hadn't fully accounted for. "You need to stay here tonight," she said. "Don't use either of your phones. Don't contact anyone." "Elena, Vivian Cross didn't just rob you, Grayson. If she had access to your files for 4 years, she had access to information about my family." Her voice was measured, but under it something was moving, fast and cold. "That changes the scope of this considerably." He wanted to ask her what that meant. He wanted to demand explanations, to reassert some version of the control he'd spent his entire adult life maintaining. But the journal was still on the table. The commission call was still in his recent history. His empire was still in the process of being systematically, surgically taken apart by the woman standing across from him in a gray cashmere sweater. He sat back down. "Who's coming?" he said. She looked at him for a moment, and the expression she wore was complex in a way he didn't fully understand, something between old grief and cold purpose, the face of a person who has spent a long time preparing for something they still didn't want to have arrived. "My brothers," she said. The brothers arrived at 2:47 in the morning. Grayson had not slept. He'd sat in the single armchair Elena had positioned near the window. Not an invitation, more like a containment decision, something to keep him stationary and accounted for, and stared at the street below while the city ran its quiet late-night mechanics. A delivery truck, a couple arguing briefly outside a bar 2 blocks over, a dog walker with 3 dogs, moving efficiently in the cold. Elena had spent the hours at the kitchen table with a laptop and 2 phones, cycling between silent reading and low-voiced calls she made and received with a frequency that suggested an organizational apparatus far larger than anything Grayson had previously attributed to her. She hadn't spoken to him directly since telling him to stay. She brought him coffee at midnight without being asked, set it on the windowsill within his reach, and returned to her table without comment. He drank it because his hands needed something to do. The knock, when it came, was 3 beats, specific rhythm. Elena was up and at the door before the 3rd knock landed. The men who entered weren't loud. That was the first thing Grayson registered, in the involuntary assessment that his nervous system ran on anyone entering a space he occupied. Large men were frequently loud simply by existing, the physical confidence of size expressing itself in movement and sound. These 3 were not. They moved with the particular quiet of men who had learned, at some point in their lives that Grayson suspected was not recent, to make themselves difficult to perceive even while fully visible. The eldest was Roman. He was perhaps 45, dark-haired, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. Not because it was blank, but because it was disciplined. He looked at Elena first, a long look that communicated something between them that Grayson couldn't decode, and then he looked at Grayson with the specific quality of attention a man gives a problem he is being asked to assess. Victor was younger by 2 or 3 years, leaner, with close-cropped silver at his temples despite being younger than his brother. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw, old and faded, the kind that had been stitched badly or not at all. He didn't look at Grayson immediately. He looked at the room, exits, windows, sightlines, and only after he'd completed that inventory did he let his eyes settle. Darius was the youngest of the 3, closer to Elena's age, and the most immediately readable, which Grayson understood after a moment was probably deliberate. He had Elena's coloring, dark eyes, and the kind of stillness that read as relaxed until you noticed the quality behind it. He was the one who spoke first. "You look terrible," he said to Grayson. "Darius," Elena said, "I'm just observing." He moved to the kitchen counter, opened a cabinet as if he'd been in this kitchen before, found a glass, and filled it from the tap. "He should know what he looks like. It'll help with accurate self-assessment." Grayson stood up from the chair. He was aware, with the particular awareness of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given room, that he was not that here. It was an unusual sensation. He decided not to fight it for the moment. Fighting it would look like insecurity, and insecurity was more dangerous than deference in a room like this. "I assume Elena told you the situation?" Roman spoke. His voice was low and carried the unhurried weight of a man who rarely had to repeat himself. "She told us her version. Now you'll tell us yours." "Her version is accurate." "Then tell it again," Victor said from near the window, not looking at him. "Differently. In your words, what you knew, what you didn't know, and when." Grayson understood what they were doing. They wanted to measure the gaps between Elena's account and his, not because they didn't trust her, but because the gaps themselves would tell them something about the shape of what Vivian Cross had accessed, and how. He sat back down, because standing while being interrogated was a posture of defiance, and postures of defiance were inefficient. He told them everything. He did not minimize. He had the strange experience of understanding, as he spoke, that minimizing to these men would be exactly as transparent as it would be to Elena, and Elena had already demonstrated she knew him at a granular level that his own staff didn't approach. When he finished, Roman and Victor exchanged a look. It lasted less than 2 seconds and contained what Grayson estimated was an entire conversation. "She had access to the Meridian shadow accounts," Victor said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "The commission routing codes." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Those codes were stored in an encrypted file on a private server. She would have needed my authentication to access." He stopped. He thought about the last 8 months. Vivian managing his devices when he traveled, handling authentication when his hands were occupied, his eyes elsewhere. He thought about 14 small, unremarkable moments that he had interpreted as helpfulness, and that now rearranged themselves in his memory into something with a deliberate architecture. "Yes," he said, "potentially." Darius, from the counter, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but carried its shape. "The commission routing codes," Roman said, and now something moved under the surface of his controlled voice. "Connect not only your operation, but 3 others, one of which is ours." The room went very still. Elena had set her coffee cup down. She was looking at Roman. "You didn't tell me that," she said. "We're telling you now." "Roman, we discovered it 2 hours ago, after your call." He turned back to Grayson, and the quality of his attention had changed. It was sharper now, less assessment, and more something that Grayson recognized from a handful of encounters in his life. The look of a man deciding whether someone in front of him was an asset or a liability, and what the appropriate response to each would be. If Vivian Cross has those codes and moves them to a competing organization, the fallout isn't financial, it's structural. Multiple operations compromise simultaneously. The commission would hold all of us accountable, including Elena's family, for the breach. Elena stood up from the table. "I had no knowledge of shared routing codes." "We know that." "Then why?" "Because it changes the geometry," Victor said, turning from the window. "You built this to take down his empire. You built it clean, with law enforcement infrastructure, legal compliance mechanisms, documented testimony. You built it so that, when it was done, the fallout was contained to him and what's his." He nodded toward Grayson without warmth. "Vivian Cross changes that. What she's carrying isn't just his exposure. It's ours. And whatever she does with it, whoever she sells it to, whoever she uses it to leverage, that's no longer a legal problem. That's an operational one." Elena was quiet. Grayson watched her absorb this, watched her recalibrate in real time, and was struck, not for the first time tonight, but more sharply now, By the extent to which the woman he'd been married to for 4 years was not a version of the woman he'd thought he was married to. She had conducted an operation inside his life with a level of discipline and intelligence that he would have admired without reservation if it had been applied to anything other than him. Watching her now, recalibrating under pressure in a kitchen at 3 in the morning, she was unmistakably these men's sister. The family resemblance wasn't physical, it was structural. It was the shape of how they thought. "What do you know about her background?" Roman asked. This was directed at Grayson. "I know what she told me. Lithuanian national, moved to the States at 14, educated in business administration, worked 3 corporate positions before I hired her 6 years ago. I ran a background check. It was clean." "A clean background check," Darius said pleasantly, "just means someone competent built her cover. I understand that now. What did she know about Elena, specifically, before tonight?" Grayson thought about it. He thought about it carefully, because he recognized that careless thinking here could have consequences he couldn't afford. "She knew Elena was my wife. She knew Elena had no visible professional role. She would have known Elena attended certain functions, maintained a social presence. She might have known Elena's maiden name." He paused. "I don't believe I ever discussed Elena's family with her." "Elena's family was—" He stopped. "Was what?" Roman asked. "Something Elena deflected. I stopped asking." Roman nodded slowly. "So she may not have known about us specifically, but she had the routing codes, which trace back to us through 3 layers of obfuscation that, if she's competent, and she is, she can eventually unpeel." "How long does she have before she can unpeel them?" Elena asked. Victor and Roman looked at each other again. "If she has the right analytical resources, which we have to assume she's either acquired or has access to through whoever she's working for," Victor said, "then perhaps 72 hours, perhaps less." Elena turned and looked at Grayson. He saw something in her face he hadn't expected. Not accusation. Accusation would have been almost comfortable compared to what it actually was. It was something closer to sorrow. Brief, quickly locked away, but real. "I need to know everything about Vivian," she said. "Everything. Not what she told you, what you observed, where she went when she said she was traveling, who called her on lines that weren't yours, what she was reading, what she was careful about." "Elena," Grayson said, "this could take—" "Start now," she said. They worked through the rest of the night and into the pale early morning, the 5 of them distributed around the kitchen table with laptops and phones and printed records that Roman had produced from a slim case he'd carried in and that Grayson hadn't seen him set down. Victor worked almost entirely in silence, running digital traces through channels Grayson didn't recognize, occasionally reading something aloud to Roman in a shorthand that contained references Grayson couldn't follow. Darius proved more useful than his initial manner had suggested. He had a photographic specificity when it came to financial structures, asking Grayson targeted questions about Vivian's movements and then mapping the answers against transaction timestamps with the efficiency of a machine. Elena sat beside Grayson. Not warmly. There was nothing warm between them that could be recovered in a single night of crisis, but present, and he understood the geometry of that. She had built her case against him meticulously, and she knew his operation better than his own executives did. She was the most effective person in the room to help dismantle the damage Vivian had caused, and she knew it, and she was doing it not for him but for the same reason she had done everything, because she had decided it was necessary. And once Elena decided something was necessary, sentiment didn't factor into it. Just after 5 in the morning, Victor made a sound. Low. Clipped. It brought all 4 other people in the room to attention. "She moved through Frankfurt," he said, 14 hours ago. "Passport in a name I don't recognize, Mira Solano, but the biometric match is high confidence. She boarded a connecting flight." He paused. "To Reykjavik." "Why Reykjavik?" Darius said. "Because," Roman said quietly, standing up from his chair and moving to look at Victor's screen, "there's a private facility in the interior, owned through 6 layers of corporate fiction by an organization calling itself the Meridian Collective, which is not," he glanced at Grayson, "related to your Meridian holdings." Grayson felt a particular cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "It's a name she chose." Yes, Roman said, deliberately. She's been planning this exit for long enough that she selected a destination and a cover name that would produce confusion with your entities during any initial investigation. By the time anyone untangled the nomenclature, she'd have completed whatever she's traveling to complete. Which is what? Elena said. Victor scrolled through something on his screen. The Meridian Collective hosts what they call private intelligence exchange events. High-end, by invitation only. The kind of event where certain types of information are presented to vetted buyers in a controlled environment. He looked up. The next event is scheduled for 48 hours from now. The kitchen went quiet in a particular way. The quality of silence in a room where everyone has just understood something simultaneously. Vivian wasn't running. She was selling. She had spent years collecting intelligence, from Grayson's operation, apparently from the Ashcroft family's routing structures, and from whoever else she'd penetrated before or alongside. And she was traveling to an auction. She's going to sell the routing codes, Elena said. Among other things, Victor said. If she has what we think she has, she's carrying enough to compromise at least 4 independent operations simultaneously. Whoever acquires that data won't use it immediately. They'll use it as leverage. Long-term, systematic leverage. The kind that reshapes organizational hierarchies across the entire network. The Commission, Roman said, will not permit that. The Commission, Darius said, with a precision that cut clean, doesn't know yet. And when they find out... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Grayson thought about the call from the asterisk number, about the 31 seconds of verdict. He thought about how much more difficult his position became if the Commission, already having stripped his protections, discovered that the woman who had lived in his penthouse and managed his correspondence for 4 years had used his operation as a staging ground to compile intelligence capable of destabilizing entities far larger and more protected than his own. He looked at Elena. You didn't know about her, he said. Not an accusation, a confirmation he needed. No, she said. I didn't. I built my case on you. I had no information suggesting a secondary operation running alongside mine inside the same space. Is it possible your case building alerted her? Gave her a signal that the structure was about to change, and she accelerated her exit? Elena was still for a moment. He could see her running it. Possibly. My final coordination with law enforcement happened 3 weeks ago. If she had any surveillance on those communications, she did, Victor said, not looking up from his screen. I'm seeing indicators of passive monitoring on the legal coordination channel you used. Someone was reading your traffic, selectively. The access points are masked, but the pattern is there. Elena absorbed that without any visible display, but Grayson saw her hand, flat on the table, press once against the surface. A single, small gesture of controlled reaction. He had never seen her do anything like it in 4 years of marriage. The fact that she did it now, in front of him, in front of her brothers, told him something about the actual cost of what they'd just discovered. She had built her operation carefully, over years, believing she controlled the geometry, and someone had been reading her mail. She used both of you, Roman said, calm, factual, no judgment in it. She embedded inside your marriage, or adjacent to it, and harvested from both sides. Grayson and Elena looked at each other across the kitchen table. It was, he thought, possibly the most honest moment they had ever occupied together. Stripped of the marriage's social scaffolding, stripped of her moral advantage over him, stripped of his empire and his certainty and his habitual arrogance, they were just 2 people who had been played by the same hand and were only now understanding the full shape of how thoroughly. I owe you nothing, Elena said to him. And then, after a pause that had actual texture, but Vivian Cross has information that threatens my family, that changes my priorities. What are you saying? I'm saying that the operation I built to dismantle your criminal enterprise is now secondarily useful as a pursuit architecture. She looked at her brothers. We have 48 hours before the auction. We have financial traces, a departure airport, and a destination city. What don't we have? Her network at the facility, Victor said. She won't be traveling alone. She'll have arranged protection at the destination. The Meridian Collective events are not unguarded. And we don't know her inventory, Darius added. Specifically, we know the general category of what she's carrying. We don't know what she's already sold, what she's withholding, what she's using as personal insurance versus what she's offering to buyers. Can you get us into Reykjavik? Elena asked Roman. We can get to Reykjavik, Roman said. Getting into the facility is a different geometry. Then that's the problem to solve, Elena said, and she was already standing, moving toward her laptop with the particular velocity of someone who has accepted a new set of parameters and is now operating within them. We have 48 hours. Let's start spending them. Grayson remained at the table. He was aware of the precise absurdity of his position. Stripped of his empire, sitting in his ex-wife's kitchen at 5 in the morning, about to join forces with the men and the woman who had systematically destroyed everything he'd built, to pursue the woman who had lived in his penthouse and use them all as a data mine. He was aware of how thoroughly, how architecturally, how completely he had been outmaneuvered by everyone in every direction. He was also aware that whatever came next, he had no leverage, no independent resources that hadn't been frozen or raided, and no allies who still had any reason to return his calls. Whatever remained of his position in the world was dependent on the willingness of Elena Ashcroft and her brothers to consider him useful enough to keep in the room. It was the most vulnerable he had been since he was 19 years old and had nothing. I need to tell you something about Vivian, he said. Elena stopped at her laptop. Roman looked at him. She has a secondary device, a physical drive. She always kept it on her person. I thought it was personal encryption backup, the kind of redundancy careful people maintain. She carried it in a specific case, carbon fiber, about the size of a matchbox. He paused. I saw her with it the morning before our... He chose the word carefully. Separation. Victor's expression changed. What morning, exactly? 6 days ago. I came into the office early and she was at her desk. She was holding the drive. She put it away when I came in, but she was looking at it. The way you look at something you're checking, confirming. She was verifying it was ready, Darius said. Yes. Which means she prepared for departure 6 days ago, not this morning, Roman said. She had a week's preparation that none of us accounted for. The weight of that settled over the table like something physical. There's more, Grayson said. He was aware that each piece of information he gave them shifted his position, reduced his remaining leverage incrementally. He was also aware that he didn't have enough leverage to justify withholding anything. 3 months ago, Vivian recommended a new security consultant for my encrypted communications infrastructure. I approved the hire. The consultant worked inside our systems for approximately 6 weeks before citing a scheduling conflict and stepping back. I reviewed his work and found nothing irregular. Victor and Roman were both looking at him with the same expression. She installed something, Victor said. She would have had the consultant install something, Grayson said. I didn't connect it until now. I don't know what. But if she had 6 weeks of architecture access through someone she controlled, then the passive monitoring of Elena's coordination channel isn't the full extent of it, Victor said quietly. He turned to his screen and began moving fast. The kind of fast that wasn't visible speed, but rather the compression of expertise into decisive sequential action. She may have had visibility into this room. He glanced up. Hypothetically. Once you were in it. Everyone in the kitchen understood what that meant simultaneously. Vivian Cross might already know that Grayson Vale was sitting in Elena Ashcroft's kitchen. She might already know that the Ashcroft brothers were in the room. She might already know they were planning to come for her. Elena turned from her laptop. Her face was, for one brief and unguarded moment, entirely honest about how serious this was. Roman, she said. I know, he said. Then we can't move from existing infrastructure. She has visibility into anything connected to either operation. Agreed. Which means we go dark. New phones, new channels, no continuity with anything either of us. She glanced at Grayson. Or he has previously used. I can have clean equipment within the hour, Darius said, already moving toward the door. And Grayson, Elena said. She looked at him steadily. Everything you haven't told us yet. Every piece of information about Vivian Cross that is still sitting in your memory because you're calculating whether it helps or hurts your position. You need to put it on the table right now, not in an hour, not when we're on the plane. Now. He looked at her for a long moment. "There's a letter," he said. "Or there was. She left something in the penthouse." "I haven't been back to retrieve it. I came directly here after the commission call. But the front desk said she left an envelope with the building manager addressed to me. I assumed it was a personal matter, a note." Roman looked at Elena. Elena looked at Grayson. "That is not a personal note," she said. And she was already reaching for her phone to call the building manager when Victor said, very quietly, from his position at the window where he had drifted back over the last several minutes, Victor, who had been running traces and reading screens, but also, Grayson now understood, watching the street below with the particular attention of a man who never fully stopped watching. "We need to move. Right now." "What is it?" Roman said. "Two vehicles, positioned at both ends of the block. They've been there for 11 minutes. I clocked them when Darius left." He stepped back from the glass. "They're not law enforcement. The positioning is wrong for surveillance. It's closer to containment," Roman said. "Yes." Elena looked at her oldest brother. Something moved between them. Not fear, but the high-voltage alertness of people who have trained for exactly this and still understand that knowing what is happening does not make it less dangerous. "She already knows we're here," Elena said. "She already knows we're here," Roman confirmed. And he said it in the tone of a man closing a door that would not reopen, a tone that meant they had just crossed from the territory of preparation into something else entirely, something with no edge they could see from where they were standing, something that was going to require them to move forward because the option of moving back had just been quietly, efficiently, and completely removed. Roman moved first. He didn't announce it, didn't gesture or give instruction. He simply shifted from standing to moving with the seamless transition of someone for whom preparation and action occupy the same breath, and the others responded to it the way a body responds to its own nervous system. Victor stepped back from the window and was already pulling on his jacket. Darius, who had made it to the front door and then stopped, reversed without question. Elena closed her laptop in a single motion and picked up both phones from the table. Grayson stood up from his chair and understood, with a clarity that had nothing intellectual in it, that he was the slowest person in this room, and that being the slowest person in this room right now carried a specific kind of risk. "Back," Roman said. One word, directional. The townhouse had a rear exit through the kitchen, a service door that opened onto a narrow passage between buildings, the kind of architectural seam that existed in this neighborhood because the buildings predated urban planning symmetry and had simply grown around each other. Roman went through it first, checked the passage in both directions with the quick, precise movement of someone who was checking not for the presence of people, but for the specific quality of shadows that indicated people trying not to be present. He waved them through. The passage was cold and smelled of stone and last night's rain. Grayson pressed through the door, and the air hit his face like a hand, sharp and immediate. His breath came visible. Behind him he could hear, faintly, the sound of one of the vehicles on the street. An engine idling, not moving, which meant whoever was in it was positioned and waiting rather than pursuing, which meant they expected the front, which meant someone had told them the front was the right place to watch, which meant the rear passage was a possibility they hadn't covered, which meant the intelligence Vivian had gathered on this location was good, but not complete. She knew Elena was here. She may not have known the specific floor plan. They moved through the passage single file, Roman, Victor, Elena, Grayson, Darius closing the rear, for approximately 40 meters before the passage opened into a service alley that ran perpendicular to the block. Roman held up a fist. They stopped. He listened. Nothing. The particular nothing of an empty space that was actually empty rather than the nothing of a space where something was holding still. He moved left, away from the street-facing ends of the block, and they followed him into the city's pre-dawn infrastructure, the service roads and loading zones and back-facing architecture that cities use for their maintenance functions and that most of its inhabitants never see. Grayson had walked through enough back-of-house spaces in his career to recognize the geometry. He fell into it without trouble. They walked 4 blocks before Roman stopped at a gray panel van parked against a loading dock. He produced a key. The van was nondescript, registered to nothing that Grayson could identify, and when he got in, he noticed the back had been fitted with equipment, hard-sided cases, a fold-down work surface, power strips running to a compact battery array. Not elaborate, functional, pre-positioned. Roman had prepared for needing to move. He'd prepared before tonight. Victor took the passenger seat. Roman drove. Elena, Grayson, and Darius occupied the back. "The letter," Elena said as soon as the van was moving. Not to Grayson specifically, to the general problem of it, as if she were working through a sequence aloud. "We need it," Darius said. "We can't go back to VCI Tower. If they had Elena's townhouse, they have VCI Tower." "Building management could forward it," Grayson said. "I can call from a clean line. It won't be enough." Elena was looking at her hands on the table surface, not at him. A physical letter from Vivian, left in advance of everything that happened, isn't a goodbye note. It's a document. Whatever it says, it was written to be read under exactly these circumstances. After the Empire fell, after she'd vanished, when we were scrambling. It was written to direct us. She looked up. To misdirect us. Or to offer terms, Roman said from the front. That landed in the back of the van like something dropped from a height. "Terms," Victor said. "She's going to an auction, not a disappearing point. She wants money, not war. A letter left for Grayson under these conditions might be an opening position." "Or it's a trap built from paper," Darius said. "Those two things," Roman said, "are not mutually exclusive." They drove in silence for a moment. The city moved past the van's small rear windows in segments. Streetlights, a closed restaurant, a parking structure. A block of residential buildings with a single lit window on the fourth floor where someone was awake at 5:30 in the morning for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. Grayson watched Elena think. He had spent 4 years in the same house with her and had never watched her think. Not like this, not at full capacity, unguarded. She'd kept it from him. He understood now that she'd kept it from him the way you keep a primary instrument safe, by not bringing it into a space where it could be assessed and countered. She had been, throughout their marriage, operating at perhaps 40% of what he was now observing. The realization was not comfortable. "Darius," she said, "can you get into the building management system remotely, pull the letter without physical access?" "Building management systems are typically low security," Darius said, already opening one of the hard cases. "Give me the building name, management company, and 20 minutes. Grayson provided both. Darius began working. The van continued moving, Roman navigating without apparent destination, maintaining a consistent speed through the city's sparse pre-dawn traffic. Grayson understood the logic. A moving vehicle was harder to fix a position on than a stationary one, and right now their physical location was information they needed to control. 17 minutes later, Darius said, "I have it." He had accessed the building management correspondence system and found a scanned copy of the envelope contents. The building manager, apparently a meticulous man, had photographed every document deposited on his desk over the last 3 months as a personal protocol. The photograph of Vivian's letter was time-stamped 11:23 a.m., which was 9 minutes after she'd left the building. She'd timed it to the minute. Darius read it aloud. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph was addressed to Grayson by first name, and it began not with apology or explanation, but with a single declarative sentence. "By the time you read this, you will have spoken to Elena Ashcroft." It proceeded from there with a composure that was more unsettling than anger would have been. She wrote about her years inside his operation with the clinical precision of an analyst completing a project report. She named specific transactions, specific dates, specific decision points where she had observed, recorded, and cross-referenced. She noted, and this was where Darius's voice slowed slightly, that her access had not begun with Grayson's employment. It had begun 4 years earlier, when she had first made contact with a man named Thomas Fell. Darius stopped reading. Victor turned in the passenger seat. Roman's hands on the wheel didn't move. "Say that again," Elena said. Her voice was very controlled. Darius read the sentence again. Vivian Cross had made contact with Thomas Fell, Grayson's original accountant, the man who kept the ledger, the man who had died in a boating accident in 2019, 4 years before she took the position in Grayson's office. "Thomas gave her information before he gave it to you," Grayson said. He looked at Elena. Elena's face had gone through something. He watched it go through something and come out the other side at an expression he couldn't read. "That's not—" She stopped. "The journal Tomas gave me. He said I was the only one he'd trusted it to. He said—" "He lied," Darius said quietly. Not unkindly. "Or he didn't know she was collecting separately," Roman said. "Tomas may have given Elena the ledger as genuine protection. He may have given Vivian different materials, such access codes, routing information, structural intelligence, without connecting the two relationships." "He was working multiple sides," Victor said. "He was a careful man," Grayson said, and the bitterness in it was involuntary. Elena pressed both hands flat on the work surface. She held them there. She was breathing carefully, and Grayson could see the effort of it. Not the breathing itself, but the decision to make it measured, to not let what she was feeling accelerate into something that would cost her acuity. "Read the second paragraph," she said. Darius read. The second paragraph was addressed not to Grayson, but, and this was written explicitly, to whoever Elena has brought into the room with her. Vivian had known Elena would share the letter. She had written to the Ashcroft family directly, through Grayson's correspondence, with the confidence of someone who had mapped the relationship structure well enough to know exactly how information would travel once it was released. The paragraph contained 3 pieces of information. The first, she had been commissioned initially by an organization she referred to only as the Consortium, whose interests were in destabilizing the Commission's territorial architecture across the northern and eastern European corridors. The second, her commission from the Consortium had concluded 18 months ago when she had gathered sufficient intelligence. Everything she had done since then had been independent. For herself, building an inventory she now intended to monetize directly. The third, one of the 3 pieces of intelligence she planned to auction at the Meridian Collective event, was not sourced from Grayson's operation or the Ashcroft routing codes. It was sourced from inside the Commission itself. Roman pulled the van to the side of the road and stopped. The engine kept running. No one spoke for a moment that felt longer than it was. "She has a commission source," Victor said. "She has, or she had," Roman said. "Past or present. If she has current intelligence from inside the Commission and she sells it at the Meridian Collective—" Victor didn't finish the sentence because finishing it was unnecessary. If a competing organization acquired Commission internal intelligence, the resulting destabilization wouldn't be limited to individual operations. It would compromise the entire governing structure of the network. The Commission's authority rested entirely on the perception of its inviolability. Evidence that it could be penetrated, its internal communications harvested and sold at auction, would trigger a collapse of institutional trust that would take years to reconstruct, during which time the resulting power vacuum would be filled violently. "This is why the Consortium commissioned her?" Elena said. She was speaking slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she was building it aloud, checking each piece as she laid it. They wanted the Commission destabilized. Vivian spent years building the intelligence package that would do it. She completed her commission, kept the package for herself, and now she's selling it to the highest bidder. Whoever buys it gets to be the organization that breaks the Commission open. "And collects whatever falls out," Darius said. Grayson sat with this. He was aware of his own position in it, of how small, how peripheral he actually was to what Vivian had been constructing. His empire, his warehouses and shell companies and smuggling corridors, his Cayman accounts and his leather ledger, and his 4 years of marriage to a woman he'd underestimated. All of it had been, from Vivian's perspective, a single data set inside a much larger collection. He had not been her target. He had been her cover. The thing about that, he thought, was that it was almost funny. Almost. "There's a 3rd paragraph," Darius said. "Read it," Roman said. The 3rd paragraph was short. 5 sentences. It said that Vivian had taken precautions against exactly this scenario. The scenario in which Elena's family pursued her before the auction. It said those precautions were in place and would activate automatically if she did not send a specific cancellation signal at 8-hour intervals. It said the precautions were targeted not at Grayson, whose exposure was already complete, but at the Ashcroft family, specifically at the Commission routing architecture that connected their operation to 2 others, which she had the capacity to expose simultaneously to law enforcement in 4 jurisdictions. It said she was not interested in deploying this option. It said she was interested in completing her auction and disappearing, and that if the Ashcroft family and Grayson Vale chose to interfere with that, the exposure would be her response. The 5th sentence said, "Tell Elena I admire her work. She built something genuinely elegant. It's a shame it was always going to be standing on ground I'd already salted." The van was very quiet. Elena's jaw was tight. Grayson could see the muscle in it working once, twice, and then going still. She was not looking at the letter. She was looking at the floor of the van with the expression of someone who has just understood, fully and without remainder, the actual dimensions of what has been done to them. "She salted the ground," Elena said. "Very flat. She was watching me build. She let me build. She needed me to build. Because my case against Grayson was what forced the timeline. The raids, the commission call, the exposure of the empire. She needed all of it to happen so that everyone's attention was fixed on the collapse. While we were watching the fire, she walked out the back." "She used your operation as a distraction," Roman said. "She used everything," Elena said. "Tomas, Grayson, me, the law enforcement coordination, the financial documentation, the testimony. She watched me spend 4 years building a legal case, and she let it run because it served her exit strategy." Grayson had a strange sensation, not sympathy exactly. He and sympathy had a complicated relationship, but something adjacent to it. He looked at Elena and saw something he hadn't seen in their 4 years together. The specific exhaustion of a person whose most careful work has just been used against them. The work she was proudest of. The architecture she'd built with patience and discipline and what he now understood had been genuine moral purpose, however much it had been directed at destroying him. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. He didn't have anything immediately useful to say, so he said the thing that was true. "She's afraid of you. That's why she addressed the letter to the room. She doesn't know exactly what you'll do, and that's the only thing about this situation she can't fully model." Elena looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not toward him, not warmly, but away from the interior of what she was feeling and back toward the practical surface. "The 8-hour signal," she said. Turning to Darius, "If she sends it from a device, I can try to locate the transmission point," Darius said. "But if she's using a clean, purpose-built device for the signal specifically, it may be. Try anyway." "Elena," Roman said. He had turned in the driver's seat to face the back of the van fully, and his expression was something Grayson hadn't seen on him yet. Not the controlled assessment of the early hours, not the operational focus of the past hour. Something more personal. "We have a problem that supersedes the auction." "I know." The precaution she described, the automatic exposure. If we move on her and she can't send the signal, "I know, Roman." "The commission routing exposure alone would end." "I know what it would end." Her voice cracked on the last word, just fractionally, and she compressed her lips and waited 1 second before continuing. "I know exactly what it would end. I built part of that architecture. I know what's connected to it and what those connections mean for the people involved." The people involved. Grayson thought about that phrase. He thought about the 2 operations beyond the Ashcroft family that were connected through the routing codes. He didn't know whose they were. He suspected, from the way Roman and Victor had exchanged looks when the routing codes were first mentioned, that knowing whose they were would not make anything simpler. "We can't let her reach the auction," Victor said. "We can't move on her directly without triggering the automatic exposure," Elena said. "Then we need to disable the precaution before we move," Darius said. "To disable it, we need to know what it is exactly, where it's housed, how it's triggered, what system it runs through. She won't have documented that." "No, but Tomas would have." Elena looked at Grayson. "Tomas built Vivian's initial access structure, the same way he built yours, the same way he built the secondary account that disappeared yesterday morning. Tomas Fell was the architect of everything she used, and Tomas Fell is dead, but Tomas Fell was a paranoid man who made 2 copies of things." Grayson understood where she was going. "You think Thomas left documentation of what he built for her?" "I think Thomas left documentation of everything. It's what he did. He was constitutionally incapable of building something without creating a record of it. The question is where the record is. His estate was liquidated after his death, Grayson said. I was the executor. I processed everything. You processed everything you were told existed, Elena said. Did you process it yourself, or did you assign it? He hadn't processed it himself. He'd assigned it to a junior associate in Morris's firm, a young man he'd never spoken to directly. He'd signed off on a summary document. He hadn't read the underlying inventory. He said so. Elena nodded once, the nod of someone whose hypothesis has just been confirmed. Tomas had a sister, Margit Fell. She lives outside of Bruges. She and Tomas weren't close, there was a long estrangement, but she was his only family, and when someone like Tomas has a copy of something he wants preserved without being found, he gives it to the person least likely to be searched. She paused. I know about Margit because Tomas told me about her in our last conversation. He mentioned her in a context that didn't make sense at the time. I filed it. I should have moved on it earlier. Why didn't you? Grayson asked. She looked at him with the direct, uncomplicated honesty of someone past the point of managing impressions. Because I was focused on you. Tomas was a means to an end for me. I got what I needed from him and I didn't look further. That was a mistake. She said it cleanly, without self-flagellation, which was somehow more striking than distress would have been. It's the mistake Vivian built her exit around. Roman had already pulled out his phone. Bruges. Bruges, Elena confirmed. We're 12 hours from Bruges by ground or 2 by air, Victor said. The Meridian Collective event is in 48 hours. If we move to Bruges, retrieve whatever Tomas left with Margit, and use it to identify and disable Vivian's precaution, we have a window. Narrow, but a window. And if Margit doesn't have anything, Darius said, then we have a different conversation, Roman said. The particular flatness of it closed off that branch of inquiry effectively. Grayson became aware, with a precision he hadn't possessed an hour ago, of what the next 48 hours were going to require. Not resources. He had essentially no independent resources remaining, not organizational support. Every person who had owed him loyalty had either gone silent or been legally compromised by the raids. Not leverage. Vivian had neutralized his leverage more completely than Elena's legal case had, because at least Elena's case was built on documented reality. Vivian's precaution was a threat with no visible shape, which made it impossible to challenge or route around. What he had was knowledge of his own operation, which Elena and her brothers needed, and a decision to make. He had spent his entire adult life making decisions from a position of power. This was the first time he was making one from the absolute bottom of a situation he hadn't constructed and couldn't control. It was different than he'd imagined it would be. Cleaner, in a strange way. There were fewer variables to manage when you had nothing to protect. I'm coming to Bruges, he said. Roman looked at him. You have what you need about my operation, Grayson said. But Thomas worked for me before he died, and I knew him for 9 years. If Margit Fell is estranged from her brother and suspicious of strangers arriving at her door before dawn asking about documents, I am the most credible person to explain why those documents matter. She'll know my name. Tomas would have mentioned me. He would have mentioned you as the man Tomas was afraid of, Victor said. Yes, which means she'll believe me when I tell her what's at stake. He looked at Elena, and that I'm not in control of anything anymore. Elena held his gaze for a moment that had actual weight. You sit in the back, she said. You don't speak until I say you speak. You don't make independent decisions. If I tell you to be quiet, you are quiet. If I tell you to leave a room, you leave it. Understood. And Grayson. She leaned forward slightly, just enough that the distance between them changed from conversational to something more direct. If at any point between now and the end of this you decide that your interests and ours have diverged enough that you want to make your own move, if you think there's an angle you can play that I haven't seen, I will know. I've been inside your thinking for 4 years. I know how you move before you move. She paused. Don't. He nodded once. Roman put the van in drive. They were 40 minutes from the private airfield when Darius, who had been working on his laptop with the particular silence of someone who has found something and is verifying it before speaking, looked up with an expression that wasn't quite alarm but occupied the same neighborhood. I ran a deeper trace on the passive monitoring Victor found on Elena's coordination channel, Darius said. The monitoring that we attributed to Vivian. And, Roman said from the front, the monitoring is real, but the access point isn't Vivian's. Darius turned his laptop screen so Elena and Grayson could see it, though the data on it meant more to its author than to either of them. The access point traces back to infrastructure registered to an entity called Praxis Advisory Group, which is, he paused, a holding company registered in the Channel Islands, whose ultimate beneficial owner through 4 layers is a member of the Commission's own administrative council. The van moved through the pre-dawn streets. Someone on the Commission, Elena said, was monitoring my case against Grayson. For the last 14 months, Darius said. Not Vivian, Grayson said. He felt something shift in his chest, the specific sensation of a floor he'd thought was solid, revealing that it was, and had been, suspended over nothing. Someone else, someone inside the Commission itself was watching you build the case. Which means, Roman said, with the quietness of a man who has just recalculated and found the new number significantly worse than the old one. The Commission source Vivian claims to have may not be a source she recruited, Elena said. Maybe a source that was already active, already feeding intelligence, already aware of everything. She looked at Darius. She might not have found a Commission leak. She might have found a Commission member who was already operating independently and made a deal with them. Or been directed by them, Victor said from the front. Or been created by them, Darius said very quietly. They sat with that for 3 seconds that felt much longer. If Vivian Cross had not been commissioned by the consortium independently, but had instead been created as an asset by someone already inside the Commission's administrative structure, someone who had spent years building her as a tool, positioning her inside Grayson's operation, watching Elena's case develop with full knowledge of what it was and where it was going, allowing all of it to proceed because it served a longer-term objective that none of them could yet see. Then nothing they had understood about the last 24 hours was actually the thing that was happening. It was a performance, built over years, for an audience of one, or a few, sitting somewhere inside the structure that was supposed to govern all of this. Elena put her hand on the work surface of the van, flat, still, the way she'd done in the kitchen. Grayson looked at it. He thought about 4 years of marriage. He thought about the ledger burning in Aspen. He thought about Vivian standing at her desk at 7 in the morning, holding a carbon fiber case the size of a matchbox, and looking at it the way you look at something you are about to use. He thought about the Commission call. 31 seconds. A verdict delivered with such certainty, such complete foreknowledge of everything that was happening, that it had reached him before the raids were even public knowledge. He thought about an asterisk on a phone screen. The Commission call, he said. His voice came out different than he intended. Quieter, with an edge he couldn't fully suppress. The 31-second call, the verdict. How did they know everything that was happening? The raids hadn't been publicly filed yet. The Cayman freeze was less than 2 hours old. The Sao Paulo corridor lockdown hadn't been confirmed. Roman said nothing. Roman, Grayson said. How did the Commission know all of that before it was visible? Roman's hands on the steering wheel did not move. He drove for 4 seconds without responding. Then he said, very carefully, because they were informed in advance. By whom? Another 4 seconds. By us, Roman said. And the weight of that single syllable, us, dropped into the back of the van and kept falling, down through everything Grayson thought he understood, through every assumption he had made about tonight, and what it meant, and who was on which side of what, until it hit something very far below that he had not known was there, and the impact of it changed the shape of everything above it. No one spoke for a long time after Roman said it. The van moved through streets that had begun to acquire the first gray suggestion of morning, that pre-dawn half-light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself rather than the thing itself. Grayson watched it through the small rear window and felt the particular quality of silence that exists when a room full of people are each separately processing the same information and none of them have reached the end of it yet. By us. He turned it over, looked at it from the angle that hurt most, because that was usually the accurate one. The Ashcroft family had informed the commission in advance, before the raids, before the Cayman freeze, before any of it became visible. They had told the commission that Grayson's empire was about to fall, which meant the commission's 31-second verdict hadn't been a response to news. It had been a choreographed step in a sequence that had been designed before tonight. "You told the commission about my operation," Grayson said. His voice was flat, not angry yet. Anger required more energy than he currently had available. "You told them before Elena moved. That was part of the arrangement." Roman said nothing. "That's why the verdict came so fast. That's why the call was 31 seconds. They already knew everything. You'd already briefed them. The call was performance, something for me to hear so I'd understand my protections were gone." He paused. "Were they ever actually gone? Or did the commission agree to suspend recognition temporarily as part of, what, a deal?" Victor turned in the passenger seat. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked like a man who has been waiting for a conversation he'd rather not have and has now accepted that it has arrived. "The commission agreed to withdraw your protections permanently. That part is real. You have no organizational standing and you won't recover it. But the call was arranged. The timing was arranged. The content was not. The verdict was genuine. Roman told them it was coming so they could respond immediately and comprehensively," Elena said. She was looking at her brother. Not with surprise, but Grayson registered that. She wasn't surprised. She was recalibrating, which was different. She'd known some version of this, or suspected it, and the specific contours were what she was now mapping. So there would be no gap, no window where you might have been able to reach out to commission contacts and buy time. "Yes," Roman said. "You didn't tell me that part," Elena said. "No." "Why?" Roman drove for a moment. The city moved past. "Because your operation was built on legal infrastructure. Clean, documented, the kind of thing that holds up in court and stays held up. We were proud of that. We needed it to stay clean." He glanced in the rearview mirror, not at Grayson, but at Elena. "What we did with the commission is not clean. It's not illegal, but it's the kind of thing that would have made you uncomfortable enough to raise objections, and we didn't have time for objections." Elena was quiet, the quiet of someone choosing between several responses and not liking any of them. "And the commission member who is monitoring my case," she said, "Praxis Advisory Group, the beneficial owner in the Channel Islands. You know who that is." Roman's hands on the wheel, still. "Roman?" "Counselor Audric Voss," Victor said. Quietly, the way you say a name in a room where saying it changes the room. "He sits on the Commission's Administrative Council. He's been there for 11 years. He's also—" A pause. "He's the person who introduced the Ashcroft family to the Commission's framework when our operation first came to their attention 14 years ago. He facilitated our recognition." "He's been protecting us," Elena said. "He's been invested in us," Roman corrected, which is not the same thing. "And 14 months ago, he began monitoring your case against Grayson. He told us about it 6 months ago." Elena turned to look at her brother's profile from the back of the van. "He told you he was watching my case." "He told us he was watching it to protect it, to make sure nothing in the law enforcement coordination channel was compromised from his end. He said he wanted to ensure that if anything touched our family through the legal process, he could manage it before it became visible." Roman paused. "We believed him." "And now," Darius said from the laptop, "Vivian Cross is traveling to Iceland to sell commission intelligence to the highest bidder, and a commission administrative council member has been watching Elena's case for 14 months. And Vivian was originally commissioned by an entity whose ultimate interest was commission destabilization." "Voss," Grayson said. It wasn't a question. No one confirmed it and no one denied it, which was confirmation. Counselor Audric Voss had spent 14 years building a position inside the Commission's administrative structure. He had cultivated a relationship with the Ashcroft family, protection, recognition, investment. He had watched Elena build a legal case against Grayson's empire, not to protect it, but to monitor it, to understand its architecture. He had built Vivian Cross, or found her and developed her, and positioned her inside Grayson's operation where she could harvest intelligence from both Grayson and Elena simultaneously. and he had told Roman he was doing it for the family's protection, which had kept Roman quiet and kept Voss invisible long enough to complete the collection. The auction wasn't just Vivian selling intelligence to outside buyers. It was Voss liquidating his inventory. Through Vivian, maintaining clean distance while the material hit the market and the commission tore itself apart trying to identify the source. He's going to burn the commission from the inside, Grayson said. Use Vivian as the visible seller, pocket the proceeds, and watch the institution he's sat on for 11 years collapse. After which, whatever fills the vacuum will need someone with institutional knowledge and existing relationships to provide stability, Elena said. Someone who survived the collapse because he saw it coming. He'd be the only person left who understood how the commission worked, Victor said. He'd own the next version of it, Roman said. The van stopped at a red light. A garbage truck moved through the intersection in front of them, large and indifferent. Grayson watched it and thought about the specific texture of a situation that has revealed itself to be so much larger than you that your own role in it is essentially decorative. His empire, Elena's case, Vivian's years of access, all of it, the entire vast and painful architecture of the last 5 years, was scaffolding, infrastructure built to support something that had nothing to do with any of them. He thought about the aspen fireplace, the ledger burning. He had been so certain, he had been such a specific and targeted kind of fool. The light changed. Roman drove. Bruges is no longer the priority, Victor said. Agreed, Roman said. We need to get to the facility before the auction opens, Elena said, before Vivian transmits anything, before Voss can establish distance from the transaction. And the automatic exposure precaution, Darius said. If we move on Vivian and she can't send the 8-hour signal, the precaution was designed by Voss, Elena said, or by Tomas, under Voss's direction, which means Voss can cancel it. Voss won't cancel it voluntarily. No, Elena said. He won't. Mount. They reached the airfield at 6:20 in the morning, and the plane was already on the tarmac. A small private jet, white. No markings beyond a registration number. The kind of aircraft that existed in the world specifically to move people between places without creating a story. Roman had arranged it with the same invisible efficiency he'd arranged everything else. And Grayson had stopped being surprised by the logistical competence of the Ashcroft operation and started simply cataloging it as a fact of the environment he was now moving through. He had been given a clean phone, new SIM, blank history, a single contact number loaded into it that connected to Darius. He had been given a change of clothes from one of the hard cases, black, utilitarian, his size approximately, which suggested someone had planned for his presence or something close to it. He hadn't asked. On the plane, Elena sat across from him at a small table while Roman and Victor occupied the front seats and Darius worked at a fold-down desk near the rear. The engines were loud enough to create a private pocket of sound between them. She looked at him directly, no preamble. Voss knows you're with us. Probably. He'll know we've connected the dots. That changes how the next 12 hours move. She leaned forward slightly. I need to know if you have any relationship with Voss, direct or indirect. Anything. I know the name. I've never had direct contact. Anyone in your organization who dealt with commission infrastructure would have moved through Voss's administrative remit at some point, she said. Think about that specifically. He thought about it. He thought about the commission recognition process, the verification, the territorial acknowledgement, the formalities that had taken place 7 years ago when his operation had grown large enough to require institutional standing. His representative in that process had been a man named Callum Reedy, his then chief of security, who had since left his employment under circumstances that Grayson had attributed to a salary dispute. Callum Reedy, he said, my former head of security. He managed the commission recognition process. Elena's expression didn't change, but she filed it. He could see her file it. Is Reda findable? Last I knew he was based in Lisbon. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years. Darius, she said, raising her voice just enough to carry over the engine noise. Callum Reedy, Lisbon, former head of security for Grayson Vale. On it, Darius said without looking up. The plane leveled off. Below, Through the small oval window, the land organized itself into the abstract geometry of altitude, roads and fields, and the dark patches of towns. Grayson looked at it and felt strangely the specific lightness of a man who has lost everything and is therefore no longer carrying it. "I want to ask you something," he said to Elena. She waited. "The 4 years, when you were building the case." He chose his words carefully, not because he was managing her, but because he wanted to be accurate. Was there any part of it that wasn't the operation? That was just—" He stopped. "No," she said. The speed of it was its own answer, and he understood that the speed was not coldness, but precision. She had thought about this. She had an answer ready because she'd already worked through the question on her own time, in her own interior, where she did her most important thinking. "I came in with a purpose. I stayed with a purpose. Everything inside those 4 years was in service of that." She paused one beat. "But that doesn't mean nothing was real." He looked at her. "Contradictions can coexist," she said. "I'm not interested in resolving that one for your comfort." He nodded. He thought that was probably the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him. They landed outside Reykjavik at just past 2 in the afternoon local time. The sky was the particular Icelandic white that wasn't quite overcast and wasn't quite clear, a diffuse brightness that made everything look overexposed. The air was cold with a wind that moved through clothing rather than against it. 2 vehicles were waiting. Men Grayson didn't recognize, quiet, compact, the same category of person as the Ashcroft brothers in the specific sense of their attentiveness to their surroundings. They exchanged nothing with Roman beyond a nod and the transfer of 2 hard cases that went into the back of the lead vehicle. They drove east from the airport, away from the city, into landscape that became increasingly stark. Lava fields under a thin crust of snow, the occasional structure appearing and disappearing against a horizon that felt closer than it should. Darius, in the vehicle behind, had been on his laptop for the entire flight and sent a summary through to Elena's clean phone in a series of short messages. She read them and then read them aloud to Grayson, because he needed to know. The Meridian Collective Facility was a converted research station approximately 90 kilometers from Reykjavik, built into a basalt ridge that made it effectively invisible from ground level until you were within 200 meters of it. It had been acquired through the Meridian Collective's holding structure 4 years ago. Its security was private and contracted, not connected to any governmental body. It had capacity for approximately 40 guests, and was currently, according to satellite imaging Darius had accessed through channels he didn't specify, showing vehicle activity consistent with 12 to 15 arrivals in the last 6 hours. The auction was scheduled for 9 p.m. local time. They had 6 hours and 40 minutes. Vivian's 8-hour signal would be due at approximately 7 p.m. based on the timeline of her departure. If she didn't send it, the automatic exposure of the commission routing architecture would trigger. They had to be in a position to either disable that mechanism or have neutralized Vivian before 7. "Voss," Roman said from the front seat, "he's the key. We need him in communication before 7. If we can establish contact and make clear that we know his involvement, he'll cancel the precaution to protect himself." "He might accelerate instead," Victor said. "Force the auction forward, trigger the exposure preemptively as cover." "He won't trigger it preemptively. The exposure damages his position as much as ours. He needs it as a threat, not a deployment. The moment he uses it, he loses it." "So we need to reach Voss," Elena said. "Before 7. We need to reach Voss," Roman confirmed. "Do we know where he is?" Darius's next message arrived on Elena's phone. She read it. She held the phone for a moment. "He's here," she said. "Darius tracked his private flight. He landed in Reykjavik 40 minutes before we did." Victor turned in the seat. Roman's jaw set. "He's going to the auction personally," Grayson said. "He's going to manage the transaction directly," Elena said. "He doesn't trust Vivian to complete it without his oversight. He's been managing this asset for years. He's not going to let it conclude without being in the room." She looked at Roman. "He'll be at the facility." "Then everything is in the same place," Roman said. The simplicity of it was almost grim. "Vivian, the intelligence, the auction. Voss, All at the facility, all before 9 p.m. All of it or none of it, Victor said. All of it, Roman said. And he said it in the tone of a man who has identified a problem's geography and is now simply a matter of crossing it. They stopped 4 kilometers from the facility as the afternoon light began its early Icelandic deterioration toward dusk. The vehicles pulled off the road into the lee of a ridge that provided visual cover, and everyone got out. The air was sharp enough to taste. Grayson breathed it and felt his lungs register the cold in a way that was almost clarifying. His body was tired. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, was running on the specific stripped-down energy of sustained crisis. But the cold organized it somehow, pressed it into something functional. Roman and Victor opened the hard cases. Inside were communications equipment, 2 sidearms, and materials Grayson assessed and didn't comment on. Victor handed Elena a small device, an earpiece paired to a secure channel. Roman checked his own weapon with the practiced, non-performative efficiency of someone for whom it was simply a tool check. Victor looked at Grayson. "You don't get one of these." "I understand." "You stay with Elena. You do not separate from Elena for any reason. If Elena tells you to get on the ground, you get on the ground." "Yes." Victor studied him for a moment. The scar along his jaw was very visible in the flat outdoor light. "You're either going to be useful or you're going to be a liability. Those are the only options available to you in the next 4 hours. Think carefully about which one you're choosing with each decision." "I've been thinking carefully since last night," Grayson said. "That's a longer stretch of careful thinking than I've managed in about 20 years. Something moved at the corner of Victor's mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. Darius stayed with the vehicles. He would manage external communications, monitor Voss's signal activity, and maintain the channel to the people Roman had positioned in Reykjavik as a secondary resource if extraction became necessary. He looked comfortable with this, which told Grayson that Darius's value was not primarily physical, and that everyone in this family knew precisely what they were. Elena pulled Grayson aside, 3 steps, enough to create a private pocket of conversation. She was wearing a dark jacket over a thermal layer and her hair was back, and she looked like someone who had compressed everything that wasn't operationally relevant into a compartment and sealed it. "When we're inside," she said low and direct, "and we reach Vivian, I'll speak to her first. Alone if possible." "Why?" "Because she addressed the letter to the room. She wants an audience. She's been managing information and managing people for years, and she's good at it. And if she gets the audience she wants, Roman, Victor, you, she'll play to the room. She'll give each of us something that's specifically designed for us. She'll manage us." Elena held his gaze. "But she doesn't have a version of me that she's prepared. She had a version of Elena the wife. Elena, the legal operation. Elena, the obstacle. She doesn't have a version of me standing in front of her without any of those structures. You want to take away her script. I want to take away her audience." She paused. "And I need you to let me. Whatever she says about you, about us, about the marriage, about what she knows, you don't react. You don't correct. You don't defend. You hold." He nodded once. She held his eyes for 1 more second. "I know that's not natural for you." "No," he said, "but I'm finding that a lot of my natural responses have been wrong." They reached the facility's perimeter as the last of the daylight gave out. The basalt ridge rose to the north, and the facility was built into its southern face. Low structures of dark concrete and reinforced glass that absorbed rather than reflected what little light remained. Exterior lighting was minimal, functional, the kind that illuminated pathways without announcing the place's existence to distance. A single security checkpoint at the vehicle entrance manned. Foot access along the ridge's natural paths, unmanned but monitored, according to the schematics Darius had transmitted. They went along the ridge. Victor went first, moving against the basalt with the careful economy of someone who is trained for exactly this terrain and exactly this darkness. Roman followed, then Elena, then Grayson. The wind off the interior plateau pushed at them steadily, cold enough to make his eyes water. He kept Elena's jacket in his peripheral vision and moved when she moved. The access point Darius had identified was a maintenance entrance at the facility's eastern end. A steel door set into the concrete, alarmed in a system that Darius had isolated and interrupted from the vehicles. It opened without sound. Victor went through, checked, waved them forward. Inside was warmth and the low ambient noise of a functioning building. Climate control, distant voices, the particular resonance of a space full of people trying to sound casual while conducting the kind of business that is never casual. The interior corridor was utilitarian, the maintenance spine of the building, behind the finished surfaces the guests would be occupying. Victor moved them forward with hand signals. They passed two doors, a junction, a utility room whose door stood open showing shelving and equipment. 40 meters in, the corridor reached a T-intersection and Victor stopped. He pressed his back to the wall and listened. Then he held up two fingers, pointed right. Two people in the right corridor. They waited. Voices approaching. Two men speaking in what Grayson identified after a moment as Russian. Their tone the unhurried professional courtesy of men who work security and are not currently alarmed by anything. They passed the T-intersection without looking left. Their footsteps continued and diminished. Victor moved right. They found what they were looking for 3 minutes later, a service room adjacent to the facility's main presentation space, separated from it by a single internal wall through which the voices of perhaps 20 people were clearly audible. Grayson pressed close to the wall and listened. He could hear the quality of pre-event social gathering, drinks, the surface-level exchange of men and women who may or may not know each other's real names and are calibrated to the etiquette of pretending otherwise. And then, distinct from the general register of the room, a voice he recognized. Low, controlled, with the precise diction of someone who has trained accent and cadence into a professional instrument. Vivian. She was in the main room, 15, 20 feet away through a wall. Speaking to someone, the words indistinct but the voice unmistakable. He had heard that voice every working day for 4 years. He had trusted that voice. He had read efficiency and competence and loyalty into that voice and had never once heard in it what he heard now, filtered through concrete and distance. The voice of someone playing a role so completely that the role had become its own kind of truth. Elena heard it too. He saw her head turn, the precise degree of attention shifting. Roman checked the time. 6:41, 19 minutes before Vivian's signal was due. He held up the display to Elena. She looked at it. 19 minutes to either reach Voss or neutralize the precaution through Vivian directly. After which the auction would begin in just over 2 hours, and whatever was in Vivian's inventory would begin to move to whoever had brought enough money to the most dangerous room in Iceland. Elena looked at the wall, then at Roman. A question passed between them without sound. Roman shook his head once, not enough time to locate Voss in the facility before the signal window closed. Elena looked at Grayson. He understood the look. He understood what she was deciding. She had said she wanted to reach Vivian alone without audience. This was the opposite of that. This was going in through a service room into a room full of 20 people, with Roman and Victor 2 steps behind her, with the signal timer at 19 minutes and no surgical option remaining. She had planned for a confrontation. She was getting a breach. He watched her make the adjustment in real time. The recalibration, the compression of a changed plan into a new one. The same process he'd watched her do at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning. She did it in about 4 seconds. "When we go in," she said, barely above a murmur to all of them, "I need 30 seconds with Vivian before anyone else speaks. 30 seconds. Roman nodded. Victor pulled the door. The main room opened in front of them. Warm, low-lit, expensive in the way that places become expensive when the people in them have enough money to choose simplicity, clean surfaces, quality materials, the absence of ornamentation as its own signal. Perhaps 18 people, distributed in small clusters, drinks in hands. A presentation set up at the far end, a screen dark, a podium unoccupied. The sudden appearance of 4 people through a maintenance door pulled the room's attention immediately and completely. Vivian was standing near the center of the room. She had a glass of water. Not a drink, water, the choice of someone who intended to stay sharp. And she was in conversation with a man Grayson didn't know. When she registered the door opening, she looked toward it the way everyone did, and then she identified the faces coming through it, and her expression did something extraordinary. It didn't break. It recalibrated. In perhaps 3 seconds, she had assessed, adjusted, and arrived at a new position. Not the panic of exposure, not the fury of interruption, but something closer to the alert composure of a chess player who has seen an unexpected move and is already running the responses. She said something to the man beside her, touched his arm briefly, and stepped toward them. Grayson felt the room the way he used to feel rooms before he got soft with power. The exits, the bodies, the weight distribution of who was where and who was aligned with whom. At least 4 of the 18 people had shifted from social posture to something more attentive. Security, or close enough. They were watching Roman and Victor in the specific way of people who were carrying and were calibrating whether to move. Vivian stopped 8 feet away from Elena. Her gaze moved once, to Roman, to Grayson, to Victor, and then settled on Elena and stayed there. "You made better time than I expected," Vivian said. 30 seconds, Elena said. Quiet, direct, the whole room dropping away in the space between them. "I want 30 seconds from you, the truth, before any of this goes further." Something moved in Vivian's eyes. Not guilt. It was further back than guilt. Closer to recognition. The recognition of someone seeing for the first time a version of their opponent that they didn't build a plan against. "Ask," Vivian said. "Voss built you," Elena said. "From the beginning. He found you, developed you, positioned you inside Grayson's operation. Everything you've done has been at his direction until 18 months ago, when you went independent." She held Vivian's gaze without blinking. "What I want to know is, when you went independent, were you running from him or were you still running for him?" The room was very quiet. Vivian looked at Elena for 3 seconds. 2. 1. And then from somewhere at the far end of the room, near the presentation setup and the dark screen and the unoccupied podium, a door opened. A man walked through it. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the particular physical economy of someone who has never in his life needed to demonstrate anything physically because he had always occupied rooms where physical demonstration was beneath the relevant register. He looked at Elena Ashcroft the way a man looks at something he has observed from a distance for a long time and is now seeing up close for the first time. "I'll answer that," said Counselor Edric Voss. "Since the question is really directed at me." He was looking at Elena. But he was smiling at Grayson, and in his right hand, held with the complete relaxation of a man who has positioned himself carefully before making an entrance, was Vivian's carbon fiber case, the size of a matchbox, holding everything. And his thumb was resting on a mechanism along its edge that Grayson understood, with a cold that had nothing to do with the Icelandic air outside, was not a drive reader. It was a transmit trigger. "The precaution," Voss said pleasantly, "doesn't require Vivian's signal. It requires mine. It always has." He looked at Roman. "You didn't know that part. I apologize for the omission." Roman's hands were still. "Sit down," Voss said. "All of you. We have 2 hours before the auction begins, and I think we should talk about what each of you is actually willing to lose before this evening concludes." Elena didn't sit. She stood in the center of the room in the low, warm light, with 19 years of preparation and 4 years of architecture and 1 very long night behind her. And she looked at Audric Voss with an expression that Grayson had never seen on her face in 4 years of marriage and had never seen on anyone's face in 43 years of living. The expression of a person who has been shown the worst possible version of their situation and has decided quietly and without announcement that it does not change what they are going to do. "No," she said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Not shouted, not performed, just the single syllable, flat and complete, with the particular density of a thing said by someone who has already counted the cost and accepted it. Elena stood in the low, warm light of the Meridian Collective's presentation room, with 18 strangers watching her and Adric Voss's thumb resting on a transmit trigger that could end her family's operational existence. And she said no, and she did not move. Voss tilted his head, a small motion, almost curious. He had the manner of a man who encountered genuine surprise rarely enough that he found it interesting when it appeared. "You understand what this device does?" "I understand exactly what it does," Elena said. "I also understand that you won't use it. I've already explained. You explained that the precaution requires your signal, not Vivian's. She took one step forward, not aggressive, simply closing unnecessary distance, which means you've been holding the actual trigger this entire time. The letter Vivian left Grayson, the 8-hour interval, the automatic exposure, that was theater. Misdirection. You gave us something to be afraid of that we could potentially solve, so we'd spend our energy trying to solve it instead of looking at who was actually holding the mechanism. Voss was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression settled from curiosity into something more genuine. You worked that out quickly. I worked it out in the van, she said, when Roman told us about informing the commission in advance. The timing was wrong for an automatic system. Automatic systems don't wait for optimal moments. They trigger on schedule. She held his gaze. You waited. You waited until we were in the room, until you could be present for it. Because you need an audience as much as Vivian does. You've been architecting this for 11 years and you want to be in the room when it concludes. Something moved across Voss's face. It was the most honest expression Grayson had seen from him in the 90 seconds since he'd walked through the door. The trigger, Elena continued, connects to a transmission system. If you send that signal, the commission routing codes go to law enforcement in 4 jurisdictions. My family's operation is compromised. 2 affiliated operations are compromised. Grayson's remaining exposure is accelerated. She paused. And Adric Voss is the man who deliberately triggered the destruction of the commission's architecture, which is the one thing the commission will never forgive. Every ally you have inside that institution becomes your enemy the moment you push that button. You've spent 11 years building your position. One transmission destroys it. I would be beyond their reach, Voss said, but the certainty in it was fractionally less than his entrance had carried. You'd be beyond no one's reach, Roman said from behind Elena. His voice was very quiet. You know that. You've always known that. The commission's reach is the one thing in this world you've never been able to calculate around. Voss looked at Roman for a long moment. Then he looked down at the device in his hand. And Grayson, watching from 8 feet away with his heart running fast and shallow in his chest, saw the specific expression of a man discovering that the thing he's been holding as a weapon has revealed itself to be a leash. The room was completely still. Then Vivian moved, not toward Elena, not toward the door. She moved toward Voss, and she moved fast. 3 steps with the coiled precision of someone who had been calibrating the moment for the last 90 seconds. And her hand came out and closed around the carbon fiber case, and she pulled, a single hard lateral pull that broke Voss's grip before his thumb could complete the pressure the trigger required. She held the device. Everyone in the room, the 18 guests, the 4 security personnel who had been tracking Roman and Victor, Voss himself, registered what had just happened in their own way and at their own speed, and the collective recalibration produced approximately 2 seconds of complete suspension before the room started moving again. Vivian, Voss said, very soft, the softness of a man who is reorienting very fast and hasn't finished yet. You told me the precaution was mine, Vivian said. She was holding the device at her side, not pointed at anyone, not deployed, just held. Her voice had changed. The controlled professional instrument was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, something raw and older. You told me I controlled the trigger, that it was my insurance, my exit. You did control it. The interval signal was yours to send. But the actual transmission was always yours. Voss said nothing. I was the insurance, Vivian said, not the holder of it. You built a system where I believed I had control of my own exit, so I'd behave as if I did, so that everyone around me would believe it too. So they'd try to find a way to stop me sending the signal instead of looking at you. Her jaw tightened. I was a component, all the way to the end. You were the most sophisticated asset I ever developed, Voss said, and it had the quality of something meant as a compliment that had entirely failed to understand why it wasn't one. Elena was watching Vivian. Grayson watched Elena watching her. He saw something shift in Elena's stance. Not softness, nothing so simple as that, but a kind of recognition. 2 women who had been pieces in someone else's architecture standing in the same room with the architect. Give me the device, Elena said to Vivian. Not a demand, almost a request. Vivian looked at her. The look lasted several seconds and contained more than Grayson could fully decode. The assessment of 2 people who had occupied the same operational space from opposite directions, and were doing the mathematics of what that meant. She held the device out. Elena took it. She looked at it for a moment. Small, carbon fiber, unremarkable. The object that had organized the last several hours of all of their lives. She turned it over in her hand once, and then she looked at Voss and she said, "I'm going to make you two offers. One of them you'll take. The first is that you cancel every operative system you've built around this auction, surrender the commission routing material and whatever else you've compiled, and cooperate with a full accounting of your activities to a party I designate. In exchange, the manner of your exit from the commission is managed in a way that doesn't require the commission to pursue you actively. You disappear, quietly, with whatever personal resources you've accumulated that aren't connected to the intelligence you've stolen." Voss was very still. "And the second offer?" "There isn't one," Elena said. "I told you there were two, so you'd listen to the first one carefully." One of the security personnel near the wall made a small movement, the kind that precedes a larger one. Victor was watching him, and whatever Victor communicated with the quality of his attention was sufficient because the movement did not complete. Voss looked at Elena for a long time. He was 60 years old and had spent 4 decades building something that had been, until approximately the last 4 minutes, the most sophisticated operation of personal institutional advancement that Grayson had ever encountered. He had built Vivian. He had built the auction. He had built his position inside the commission like a man laying the foundation for a building he intended to still be standing in when everything around it fell. He was looking at a woman in her mid-30s who had come in through a maintenance store and dismantled the last 3 minutes of his exit strategy with the same quiet efficiency that she had dismantled Grayson's empire over 4 years. And Grayson could see in Voss's face the specific expression of someone who has spent their life being the smartest person in every room and has now, for the first time, encountered a room where that isn't true. "You'll need documentation," Voss said, "for any accounting to hold." "I have documentation," Elena said. "I've had documentation for 14 months, since your Praxis advisory group first accessed my coordination channel. I've been building a parallel file on you the same way I built the file on Grayson. I just hadn't needed to open it yet." Grayson heard himself exhale. He hadn't known he'd been holding it. Voss sat down. Not directed to, he simply sat in the nearest available chair, with the deliberate movement of a man accepting a new set of coordinates. "The commission will want someone to answer for the intelligence breach. If I cooperate, they'll still want a face." "The commission," Roman said, moving forward for the first time, "will receive a complete accounting of how their administrative architecture was penetrated, by whom, and over what timeline. The face they'll want is yours. The question is whether you provide it voluntarily, with terms, or involuntarily, without them." Voss looked at Roman. A long look, between two men who had known each other for 14 years in the specific way of people who had conducted business inside a structure of institutional formality and had never been entirely honest with each other in any of it. Something passed between them that Grayson wasn't part of and didn't try to read. "Terms," Voss said. What followed was not cinematic. That was the thing about the actual conclusion of large and terrible things. They ended in paperwork and phone calls and the particular exhaustion of people who have been running on adrenaline for too long and are now converting back to ordinary human function, which is slower and more uncomfortable than the crisis that preceded it. Roman made calls. Victor managed the room. The 18 auction guests, most of whom were sophisticated enough to understand that the event they'd traveled to Iceland to attend was not going to occur, and who left with the efficient quietness of people accustomed to disappearing from situations that had shifted against them. The 4 security personnel were dealt with in a manner Grayson wasn't closely involved in and didn't inquire about. Darius arrived from the vehicles 40 minutes after Elena had taken the device from Vivian, and he spent the next 2 hours at the facility's server infrastructure with the focus of a man doing the most important technical work of his life, which Grayson suspected was literally true. Every file Vivian had collected, every piece of intelligence in the inventory she'd assembled over years, isolated, copied to controlled storage, and stripped from the auction system before a single packet of it could reach an outside recipient. The commission routing codes, the commission internal intelligence, the material sourced from Grayson's operation. All of it. Vivian sat in a chair near the presentation setup and watched Darius work. She had not attempted to leave. She had not spoken much since handing Elena the device. She was, Grayson thought, in the specific state of someone who has run a very long race and reached the finish line only to find it wasn't where they expected, and is now simply sitting with the aftermath of the distance they've covered. He sat down in the chair beside her, not because he had a plan for the conversation, but because something in him required it, some accounting that wasn't yet complete. She looked at him sidelong. "You want to ask me how much of it was real?" "No," he said. "I know how much of it was real." He paused. "I want to ask you what you were going to do after the auction, after you disappeared." She was quiet for a moment. "I had a place, prepared for 4 years, somewhere no one had architecture on. Just a place." Something in her voice shifted for the first time towards something that wasn't performance or precision. "I was going to be nobody for a while. See what that felt like." "That sounds like something a tired person would want." "Yes," she said, and then, very quietly, "I am very tired." He thought about saying something more. He had spent 4 years trusting her, had built dependencies on her that he hadn't fully mapped until they were gone, and there was a version of this conversation that involved anger and accusation and the full accounting of what her presence in his life had cost. He could feel the weight of that version. He chose not to open it. Not because he'd forgiven anything. He wasn't built for the kind of forgiveness that arrived before the dust settled, but because the cost of carrying it out loud right now exceeded what he had left. "Tired is honest," he said. He got up and left her with it. Grayson found Elena outside. She was standing at the facility's eastern edge, where the basalt ridge dropped away and the interior plateau opened up, dark and enormous under a sky that had gone from the diffuse Icelandic white of afternoon to a deep, clear black, enormous with stars the way skies in unpopulated places allow themselves to be. She had her arms crossed against the cold, not tightly, the way you cross your arms when the cold is present, but you're not ready to go back inside yet. He stood beside her. Not close. Appropriate distance. He'd become more careful about distance in the last 24 hours than he'd been in 20 years. "How's your hand?" she asked. He looked at it. He'd cut the heel of his palm during the movement through the facility, caught the edge of a doorframe in the dark, and hadn't registered it until the adrenaline dropped. There was dried blood at the base of his thumb, already stiffening. "It's fine." She glanced at it and then back at the horizon. "Victor will have a kit in the vehicle." Later, he looked at the stars. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "The Tomas Ledger," he said. "When I burned it in Aspen, I was certain I'd burned the only copy. I had no reason to think. He told me it was the only copy, and I believed him." He paused. "I've been thinking about why I believed him. I believed him because believing him was convenient, because the alternative required me to keep looking, to keep being uncertain, to not be able to close the file and move on." He exhaled. "I do that. I've always done that. I decide what the shape of things is, and I stop checking." Elena said nothing. "I did it with you," he said. "I decided what shape you were. Quiet, capable, no independent agenda. And I stopped checking. Because checking would have been uncomfortable. Because the alternative was having to actually look at the person I was living with and account for what I saw." He turned to look at her profile in the dark. "I want you to know I understand that. Not as an apology. You don't need my apologies. As an accounting. For myself." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved across the plateau and pushed her hair, and she didn't move to correct it. "You were not the worst version of yourself in our marriage," she said finally. "That's a low bar. But it's true." She paused. "You were a man who had made decisions a long time ago that had closed off certain rooms in him. And by the time we were married, those rooms had been closed long enough that you'd stopped remembering they were there." She looked at him. "That's not an absolution. It's just accurate." "The rooms," he said. "The capacity for actual examination. Of yourself. Of the people around you." She turned back to the horizon. "I watched you for 4 years. You're intelligent. You see things quickly and you use what you see effectively. But you don't examine. You deploy." He sat with that. It landed the way things land when they're true and you've known them at some level for a long time and have simply never been required to hold them in front of you until now. What happens to me, he said, after? The criminal proceedings will be significant. Morris is good, but the documentation is comprehensive. You're looking at cooperation agreements, restitution structures, probably reduced exposure if you provide testimony on the broader network. You won't serve a life sentence. She said it without comfort and without cruelty, the way she said most things. You'll lose everything you built, the properties, the portfolio, the operational entities, all of it. What you keep is what was legitimately acquired before the operation became what it became, which isn't nothing, but it's much less than what you've had. And you, he said. She considered. The Ashcroft family's legal exposure depends on what the commission does with Voss's cooperation agreement. Roman has relationships there that give us room. It won't be simple, but we've been careful for a long time about keeping the legal infrastructure separate from the operational. She paused. My work, the case I built against your empire, and that stands. The testimony holds. The documentation is intact. Whatever else Vivian did with the architecture, she couldn't touch what was already submitted and on record. She said it was elegant, Grayson said, in the letter. Elena's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more private than a smile. An expression that lived below that register. She was right about that, at least. It was, he said. I didn't see it while it was being built, but it was. She looked at him with the expression he'd seen a handful of times in the last day. The one he couldn't fully decode, that had something old and genuinely complicated in it, nothing resolved about it, nothing that needed to be resolved tonight or possibly ever. Go get your hand looked at, she said. Victor will complain if you bleed in his vehicle. He almost smiled. He turned to go back inside. Grayson. He stopped. She was still looking at the horizon. Her voice was careful in the specific way of someone choosing precision over ease. It wasn't all the operation, the 4 years. She didn't look at him. I want that on record, somewhere, even if the record is just this conversation on a basalt ridge in Iceland. A pause. Not for your comfort, for the accuracy of the thing. He stood in the cold for a moment with that. Thank you, he said. And he meant it in a register that had nothing to do with gratitude for the statement itself and everything to do with the fact that she'd made it when she didn't have to, when it cost her something to make it, when the easier and more defensible choice would have been silence. He went back inside. Vivian Cross was taken into formal custody by a commission-designated authority, not law enforcement, not in any governmental sense, but the specific institutional accountability structure that the commission maintained for its own internal breaches, in the early hours of the morning. She went without struggle. She asked for the location of the bathroom first, washed her face for a long time, and came back out and submitted to the process with the exhausted compliance of someone crossing the last distance of a very long journey. She looked at Elena once as they were taking her out. Elena looked back. Nothing was said. The expression Vivian carried wasn't contrition exactly, and it wasn't defiance either. It was something closer to the look of one professional acknowledging another across the completion of a contest that neither of them had entirely won, and neither had entirely lost, and which had cost both of them things they wouldn't finish counting for a long time. The door closed. Audric Voss departed under different circumstances. Not in custody, not immediately, but under a framework of documented agreements and institutional leverages that amounted to the same thing extended across a longer timeline. His resignation from the Commission's Administrative Council was submitted electronically before dawn. His cooperation with the accounting process was structured, supervised, and binding. He would not go to prison. Men of his architecture and patience rarely did. But he would spend the remainder of whatever institutional life he had left in a radius of accountability that he would never fully escape. He passed Grayson in the corridor as he was leaving. He stopped for a moment. He looked at Grayson with an expression that was, Grayson thought, the most genuine thing the man had produced all evening. She built something better than either of us, Voss said. Quiet. No longer performing anything. Grayson looked at him. Yes, he said. She did. Voss walked out. The Ashcroft brothers left Iceland the way they had arrived, efficiently, with the minimum of ceremony, carrying their equipment and leaving no visible trace of their presence in the facility beyond the thoroughly cleared server architecture and 3 security personnel who had been secured and would be found in the morning by whatever maintenance staff arrived first. Roman said goodbye to Elena the way families say goodbye when they have come through something hard together and don't have language for it yet. Briefly, physically, the grip of his hand on her shoulder carrying what the words didn't try to. Victor gave a single nod. Darius hugged her for 3 seconds longer than was strictly necessary and didn't apologize for it. Grayson shook Roman's hand. Roman allowed it. It was more than he'd expected. He and Elena rode back to Reykjavik in the same vehicle, and for most of the drive they didn't speak, and the silence was the kind that exists between people who have spent an enormous amount of compressed time together and have temporarily exhausted the language for what any of it meant. The city materialized ahead of them, lights against the dark, ordinary and permanent, in the way that cities remain themselves regardless of what occurs in their vicinity. At the airport, waiting in a private terminal while the paperwork for their respective departures was arranged, Elena opened her laptop and worked. She worked the way she worked, with the total focus of someone for whom work was not a displacement of feeling, but simply the shape that purpose took in her hands. She was building the submission package, organizing the documentation, structuring the cooperation agreements, making the formal record of what had occurred in an Icelandic basalt facility into something that would hold up inside institutional processes that moved slowly and required precision. Grayson watched her for a while and then stopped watching and looked at the window instead, at his own reflection in the dark glass. 53 years old, one cut hand wrapped in gauze, 2 days without sleep, wearing borrowed clothes, with nothing to his name that a good attorney couldn't help him navigate the recovery of. He looked, he thought, like exactly what he was. A man on the far side of the consequences of his own choices, seeing them clearly for what might have been the first time. He had spent 20 years building power and 12 hours watching it serve as raw material for someone else's operation. He had spent 4 years living with a woman he hadn't looked at, and 12 hours looking at her more clearly than he'd looked at anything in his life. He had believed he was the architect of his world, and had turned out to be a component in architectures built by people more patient and more careful than he had been willing to be. There was, he thought, a version of a man on the far side of all of that who learned nothing from it, who reconstructed, as quickly as available resources allowed, the same structure with the same foundation, because structure and foundation were the only language he'd ever learned. He didn't want to be that version. He wasn't certain he knew how to be another one. But the wanting of it was there, in his chest, uncomfortable and genuine, not the wanting of ambition, which he knew well, which had a clean and energizing taste. This was something rougher, the wanting of a man who has had the floorboards pulled up and is standing on the substructure of himself for the first time in a long time, finding it different than he'd assumed. "Elena," he said. She didn't look up from her screen. "Is there anything I can do for the submission, any piece of it that my testimony would strengthen?" She looked up then. She studied him with the specific attention she applied to things she was genuinely assessing rather than managing. "There are 6 transactions in the documentation where third-party testimony would accelerate the cooperation agreement timeline significantly," she said. "Your first-hand account of those transactions, submitted through Morris with the appropriate coordination, would close gaps that would otherwise take months to fill through documentary evidence alone." "Tell me which ones." She turned the laptop toward him and pointed. He read them. They were not comfortable reading. They were transactions that documented decisions he had made clearly and with full awareness of what they were, and seeing them in Elena's precise, unsentimental documentation was the specific discomfort of a mirror held without flattery. He read every line. He didn't look away. "I'll speak to Morris tomorrow," he said. "On everything you need." She nodded. She turned the laptop back. She returned to work. He sat with his cut hand and his borrowed clothes and the weight of 43 years of accumulated choices, and after a while he found that the weight was not intolerable. It was real, and it was his, and those were different things from intolerable. He had spent a long time not examining the difference. He had time, now, to learn it. Their flights departed within 40 minutes of each other in the early morning. Elena's first, heading west. She stood from the terminal seat and closed her laptop and shouldered her bag with the fluid economy of a woman who had moved through enough airports to have eliminated all inefficiency from the process. She stopped in front of him. He stood up. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him across the table in her kitchen the night before, or rather, 2 nights before now, though it occupied a span in his memory that felt much larger than 48 hours, the way compressed experience always did. The look that was honest about what it contained and didn't simplify it into something easier to hold. "Don't reconstruct it," she said. He knew what she meant. She meant the empire, the architecture, the whole structure of power as purpose that had organized his life from the time he was 19. "I don't know what else I know how to build," he said. "Then start there," she said, "with not knowing. It's better ground than what you had." He thought about the rooms she'd said were closed. He thought about the floor he was standing on now, and what it felt like to stand on something you hadn't examined in a long time. He thought about the aspen fireplace and the certainty with which he'd watched what he thought was the last copy of something burn, and how wrong certainty could be as a foundation. "What you built," he said. "The case. The years of it. I want you to know I understand that it wasn't... I understand the cost of it. For you." She was quiet. 4 years is a long time to carry something like that, he said, regardless of the reasons. She looked at him for one more moment, and the expression she wore was the one he'd seen on the ridge, the private, unresolvable one that lived below the surface of everything she presented to the world. Not forgiving, not closed, not any of the clean things, just human and honest and real. "Take care of your hand," she said. She walked to her gate. He watched her go. He watched her the way you watch something you have only recently understood the actual nature of. Too late to do anything differently, but not too late to understand it fully, which was perhaps the only version of understanding available to him now, and which would have to be sufficient. She didn't look back. She walked with the particular posture of a woman who has completed something and is moving without encumbrance toward whatever came next. No performance, no statement, just motion, purposeful and clean, in the direction she had chosen. He sat back down in the terminal seat. His flight was in 38 minutes. Around him, the airport ran its early morning operations. Cleaners, gate agents, the first travelers of the day moving through with their luggage and their ordinary destinations. People going toward things rather than away from them. The whole ordinary machinery of a world that had nothing to do with any of what had occurred in the last 2 days, and didn't know and would never know, and was, for all of that, entirely intact. He put his cut hand in his lap. He closed his eyes. He sat in the specific quiet of a man who has nothing to manage, nothing to protect, nothing to deploy, and who is discovering, slowly, at the speed the body learns things rather than the speed the mind does. That quiet of that particular kind is not the same thing as emptiness. It was the first new thing he had learned in a very long time. Outside the terminal windows, the Icelandic morning arrived without ceremony, gray and gradual and real, the sun climbing somewhere behind the overcast, making its way regardless of whether anyone was watching for it. The light that reached the windows was diffuse and without drama. It was enough to see by. It would have to be enough to begin with. He thought it probably was.